Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session, we are going to continue further in our series on key text in social system and humanities. And under this series, we are going to discuss on M.K. Gandhi's Hind Swaraj. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Professor Maitri Chaudhary. Professor Maitri Chaudhary is from a Center for Study of a Social System, JNU. Dear friends, we know that you might always have lots of questions in mind, and while listening to today's session, if you feel so, your questions to be answered, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our toll-free number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. You are requested to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture, as well as you are requested to ask questions pertaining to the topic only. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Professor Maitri Chaudhary, once again. Hello, ma'am.
Thank you very much. So today, as has already been mentioned, we'll be discussing M.K. Gandhi's, that is Mahatma Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, which he wrote in 1908. In keeping with the spirit of this series on social sciences and humanities, I want to sort of restate or repeat some of the points that we raised in the earlier sessions. One was that we are going to take texts which are across disciplines, which would be relevant to all people interested in social sciences, whatever be their subject, as well as in humanities like literature or philosophy, history, and we would also take texts which are from the West, as well as texts from this part of the country and India in specific. So we began with sociological imagination, and we move now to Hind Swaraj, 1908. The other point I want to reiterate before we move forward is that when we read a text, there are a couple of points I would like to emphasize, and it is important to keep them in mind. One is the context of production. That is, when did a person, the author, the writer, write that text? What was the situation, the social, political, cultural, economic situation at that point of time? How did that situation impact what was being written? That is the context of production. The second, the context of reception. That is, we today in 2018, more than 100 years, how relevant is Hind Swaraj for us today? Why are we reading this text? Does it reflect on some of the issues which we confront today? And the third, apart from context of production, context of reception, context of circulation, how does a text circulate? Some texts circulate within disciplines, specifically say sociology or political science or literature, very often travel through syllabi, construction of syllabi. Certain other texts travel because it contains messages which cut across disciplines, which are political, which raise issues about humanity across certain disciplines. Hind Swaraj, to that extent, is a text which transcends disciplinary boundaries, which arises with key questions which Gandhiji was addressing in a colonial context, with questions about modernity, with questions about civilization. One of the attempts in my discussions and in this series is to capture the manner in which this text was presented. So you have here that Hind Swaraj, which means India Home Rule, and this is a kind of photocopy of the text as it is. Who was it printed by? By M.K. Gandhi, published by Jitendra Desai, Navjivan Publishing House, Ahmedabad. So I want to sort of capture Harijan, the journal that he was writing. It was republished there. So I want to give a sense of the text, because very often what happens in our country, or very often in our system, that we very rarely look at the text in origin. You're a lucky generation. Hind Swaraj is now available on the internet, so all you have to do is Google and find out. The other aspect of this series is to look at the author's intent. We talked about context of production, circulation, reception, But here it's also interesting to know when it was written, what was his intent. And Gandhiji writes that it is my fortune that this booklet, he calls it a booklet, is receiving wide attention. It will be interesting for you to know that the original was written in Gujarati and it had a very checkered career, strange career, unexpected turns. It was first published in the columns of the Indian Opinion of South Africa. It was written in 1908 when Mahatma Gandhi was on a return voyage by ship from London to South Africa in answer to the Indian School of Violence and its prototype, the kind of violence which was taking place in South Africa. So he was responding to a particular context of that period of time. The other aspect that I want to convey is the importance of looking at the content page of these original key texts. And you will see that there's a whole set of contents in that about the discussions within the Indian National Congress, which at that period of time was leading the anti-colonial national movement. Partition of Bengal, not the 1947, but partition of 1905, discontent and unrest, Swaraj, condition of England. I'm not going to read it out, it's there available for you, nor will I be able to convey to you the content of each of these subjects. But I will focus on certain themes and I will return repeatedly by asking what exactly did he mean by Swaraj. The other very interesting part of this text is the format. The manner in which the entire Hind Swaraj is written in a form of a conversation, between a reader and the editor, hypothetically, of a newspaper. And the reader and the editor, of course, in actual parlance was Gandhiji himself, but you have a kind of asking of question, making of comments and response by Gandhi at different points of time. So the reader says that, look, there is a home rule movement now in India and everybody is asking for national independence, and the similar spirit is there even in South Africa. And the reader is asking Gandhiji, what is your response to this movement? And Gandhiji, as the editor, makes a very interesting observation, and he in fact touches upon the role of a newspaper. The role of a newspaper in contemporary India, where there's a lot of debate and discussion about the role of media and the proliferation of the media in contemporary India, it's important to go back and see what is it that Gandhiji was saying. And he says that there are a couple of objects of the newspaper. One, to understand popular feeling and give expression to it, what people are feeling and give expression to it. Another is to arouse among people certain desirable sentiments. Say at that point of time, sentiments to fight for nation, to fight against colonialism. And the third is fearlessly to expose popular defects. Very interesting. So it's not just important to give expression to people, but create desirable sentiments. So people may feel very violently about particular groups or communities or certain kind of sentiments. The newspaper or the media, according to Gandhi, is not only to express it, but create sentiments and expose problems which would create a better society. So here I just want to make the point, which is so important in the series on the text, that how relevant some of these observations are today in contemporary India. And the reason is because some of the issues which Gandhiji raises in Hind Swaraj are related to questions of modernity, the crisis or the challenges of a modern society, modern institutions, and the need to engage and critique and understand modernity. In that sense, Gandhiji's Hind Swaraj can be seen perhaps sometimes as an anti-modernity critique, but at other times also to make us understand the nuances of a certain kind of media. Now, he says the exercise of all these functions of the media is to, as been mentioned earlier, that you have to express people's views and bring in the challenges of people in power. And he says that, look, young people at that point of time, when you say impatience with the older Congress leader, there was a debate between the newer Congress leaders, younger leaders at that point of time, who wanted home rule. And the older leaders, say maybe Professor Gokhale, who would have a different kind of position. And Gandhiji then goes on to say that, look, you have to understand people's views in the context that they were holding it. And you cannot condemn a person for holding a view which is different from yours. And I will just quote, because again this is very relevant in the contemporary context. It's a bad habit to say that another man's thoughts are bad and ours only are good, and that those holding different views from ours are the enemies of the country. Again, you notice something which is so relevant, the need for argument, debate, discussion, tolerance of different kinds of views. This is another aspect which I am drawing from Hind Swaraj, his observations on the Englishmen. Remember, that was the time when we were colonized, we were fighting against the British. So it would be natural for a lot of people to nurture great hatred for English people. Now, Gandhiji was very strongly, in contra, disagreed with that view and said, look, there can be good English people and there could be bad English people, there could be good Indians and there could be bad English people. Many English people, in fact, desire home rule for India. That the English people are somewhat more selfish than others is true, but does it prove that every English person is bad? We who seek justice will have to do justice to others. We who seek justice will have to do justice to others. This was in fact not just Gandhiji's view, but a very dominant strand in the Indian national movement against British colonialism. The idea of internationalism as standing by with people of the oppressed people across countries. So when Gandhiji was fighting racism in South Africa, he was fighting for everybody who was there against the whole question of white supremacy or white racism. So you don't have to hate a person on the basis of the color or they belong to a country who may have colonized you. And as many of you would be familiar, in the national movement, there were English people who actually fought alongside with Indians for Indian independence. A little bit maybe on questions of social movements and why the partition was so important in 1905. The Britain at that point of time decided to divide Bengal, and there was a huge protest which took place, and people marched into the streets protesting against this partition, and finally the British rulers or the colonial rulers had to accede to their demand. And the reader in Hind Swaraj is asking that what was the results of this partition, and Gandhiji as an editor is responding that earlier on we were restricted in our social movements by petitions, that you basically went to the government and you said, look, this is our petition, we are requesting you to look into this. But after the partition, people saw that petitions must be backed by force and they must be capable of suffering. That is, it is not enough to go to the government and say, look, we want this or we do not like this, but it is important to say that, look, people would sacrifice, suffer in order to put their force behind that petition. Here he is making actually an observation about the nature or the different stages of social movements, equally relevant to the contemporary period. And he talks about the new spirit which sort of captured India after the partition of Bengal in 1905, and he said the spirit was evident in the outspoken writings in the press, that which the people earlier said tremblingly and in secret began to be said and to be written publicly. This is very, very important to understand, that here he is really talking about the citizens' ability to mobilize social protests, social movements, and galvanize people and approach even a colonial, an alien state and say, look, we want it. And he says this is the period that the Swadeshi movement was inaugurated, and everyone, young people, old people who would earlier be very frightened of even looking at an English face was no longer in awe of them. They do not fear even a row. They do not fear imprisonment. Some of the best sons of India are at present in banishment. This is something different from petitioning. Thus our people moved. The spirit generated in Bengal spread to the north, to the Punjab, and in the south to the Cape Comorin. So here he is describing in a very interesting fashion the growth of the national movement, the shift from petition to social mobilization which was taking place at that point of time. There are other points that I want to again draw, like I emphasized why the media or the newspaper was so important for Hind Swaraj, but it's equally important, say, religion. Globally, across the world, religion has become a very, very important issue. At one point of time, people assumed that with modernity, religion will decline and will increasingly move towards a more secularized world. But wherever, whether it's in our country, South Asia as a whole, in the West, in the United States, in Europe, you have the issue of religion which has acquired a greater and greater say. And Gandhiji himself was a deeply religious person, and so the reader, remember the reader is also Gandhiji and so is the editor, the reader says that, look, telling Gandhiji that you seem to be encouraging all kinds of religious charlatanism, all kind of cheat, and you're encouraging them to people, making people lose track, go astray. And the editor says that, look, you can't have an unlawful charge against religion. Indeed, there is a lot of humbug in all religion. But he said, wherever there is light, there is also shadow. And he says that it is important to find out the basic core of civilization in all religions. So here is his more complex understanding of religion, where he acknowledges the light in religion, but also the shadow of religion. He is open to this critique. He is not sort of blindly affirming or blindly negating. This again is a very important lesson from the leaders of our national movement, including Gandhiji, the ability to debate, the ability to open your mind to diverse kinds of views. Now he brings in another point in this particular slide that you are watching, the questions of the relationship between different religious groups and its implications for a united nation. The reader, remember the reader and the editor are both Gandhi, the reader says, how can you say that religion doesn't have an adverse impact? After all, in the name of religion, Hindus and Mohammedans fought against one another. For the same cause, Christians fought Christians. And the reader then goes on to ask that, has not the introduction of Mohammedanism unmade the nation? Very, very important in the current context of a debates on nation and diversity, not just in our country, in the United States of America, in large sections of Europe, where the whole issue of whether diversities weaken nations or diversities strengthen nations. And here the question being put is, has the introduction of Mohammedanism not unmade the nation? And the editor, who of course is again Gandhi, says, India cannot cease to be one nation because people belong to different religions live in it. The introductions of foreigners does not necessarily destroy the nation. They merge in it. A country is one nation only when such a condition obtains in it. The country must have a faculty for assimilation. India has always been such a country. We have to remember that in India, people have come for centuries. Why centuries? Over thousands of years across our borders from different parts, sometimes from Central Asia, sometimes from Southern Russia, sometimes from the Middle East, sometimes from the Southeast Asia, sometimes from South China into the Indian subcontinent. They have settled at different periods of time. They have brought in their own cultures and rites and religions, and over a period of time developed a unique civilizational ethos. This is the point that Gandhiji is making, and directly addressing issues which were relevant at the time that Hind Swaraj was published, in 1908 and continues to be of relevance today. United States of America, where again you have contestations of ethnicity, different origin, different religions, and many Americans would say that that country has done so well because people from different parts of the world have reached there with best of their ability and have contributed to the growth of a rich and diverse society. Gandhiji then goes on to develop this question of individuals, religions, and the nation. And he says, in reality, actually, there are as many religions as there are individuals. But those who are conscious of the spirit of nationality do not interfere with one another's religion. If they are not to be considered a nation. If the Hindus believe that India should be peopled only by Hindus, they are living in a dreamland. The reason that India were able to fight the British and became a very, very impressive nation despite its many inequalities, its many marginalities and poverties, was this recognition of diversity, recognition of multiculturalism, which is so central to the strength of the Indian nation. The Hindus, the Mohammedans, the Parsis, the Christians have made India their countrymen, our fellow countrymen, and they will have to live in unity if only for their own interest. In no part of the world are one nationality and one religion synonymous terms, nor has it ever been in India. This is actually very interesting for people who do social sciences. Issues of ethnicity, issues of religion as a community, and issues of nationality based on civic notions of constitutionalism. This is contemporary. So when you see something like 1908 as a date, you may feel that's, sort of so many years ago. It's something really, really dated. But you read Hind Swaraj and you are amazed at its contemporary nature. This sort of goes on, and there is now another aspect of Gandhiji's Hind Swaraj, and I will sort of systematically take it one by one. But here I want to go back to an original question which the reader asked, that what is Swaraj? And Gandhiji is actually trying to say that Swaraj is something very complex, very deep. It doesn't mean that if you throw off the British, we are going to be independent, that we are going to attain Swaraj, that we are going to have home rule. Because the British is not just about the English people as a group of people or the ethnicity. It means certain institutional structures, certain economic organizations which are characteristic of modernity and with which Gandhiji had a certain problem. So it is in that context he is debating the whole issue of modernity. As you are familiar, Gandhiji had a certain kind of alternative vision of development. This becomes particularly true in the contemporary period as we face questions of global warming, centralization, questions of a lack of autonomy, people mindlessly running to do better and better, a certain kind of idea that achievement is central to our life, doing better than the others is central to our life. And Gandhiji was one of the first thinkers, early thinkers, to be a little wary of accepting modernity with its structures and values in its whole. So he is arguing that it's not enough to throw away the British. It is important to have a certain model of development which becomes very, very important. And it's through the book that when he starts having a discussions on railways, on lawyers, on doctors, on questions of diversity, that we start looking at on machinery, that what was Gandhiji's critique of modern civilization and what was the kind of model of development that he was putting forward. This becomes important in the contemporary context, and we can then ask the question that does it mean that Gandhiji was somebody who was anti-modernity? Can we go and argue that he was anti-machinery? Was he so foolish that he felt that we can just go back to a pristine past? Or was he opening up, prizing up a taken for granted common sense that yes, progress is necessarily good, modernity is necessarily good? Or was he engaging in a more critical fashion with the structures of modernity? As we shortly move into a break, I will stop here and go on to his discussion about the structure of modernity in detail after the break. Right now, before I wind up, we talked about the context of production, the context of reception, the context of circulation, and through this exposition, I'm repeatedly drawing your attention to the persistent relevance of this text. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to be with us as we are going to be back after a short break and we are going to discuss more. Thank you. Thank you for watching us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on Mahatma Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, and we are giving you deep insight into the Hind Swaraj. And for the discussion we have with us in our studios Professor Maitri Chaudhary. Professor Maitri Chaudhary is a renowned professor of sociology, and she is associated with the Center for Study of Social System, JNU. Friends, if you have any question regarding to today's lecture, then do feel free to talk to us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Professor Maitri Chaudhary, once again. Hello, ma'am. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. To continue our conversation today, we were just discussing how Hind Swaraj can also be read as a text where Gandhiji is engaging with the problems of modernity, what he calls the problems of civilization, problems which he associated with the civilized Western world, and something which he was wary or uncomfortable that India too would follow that path. So here we have this whole issue of railways, lawyers and doctors. And in our society, I mean, normally we would always look at railways positively, lawyers positively, doctors positively. We would also look at them as inevitable as structures of the contemporary period. Very difficult for the contemporary generation to imagine an India where there were no railways. But indeed, there were no railways in India until the British came. And the point that Gandhi was saying, why did the railways emerge in India? The question about lawyers and the whole question of conflicts and the long court battles which took place, and whether it's necessarily good or bad, and we can open up the discussion. And the third, the doctors. All of us know that when we are not well, we have to go to doctors. So what's wrong with doctors? But we also know that very often when we are unwell, we get a little tired by the manner in which doctors may not, but also may make us go from one doctor to the other, one test to the other, the kind of hazards of the modern medical system, which doctors themselves are increasingly sensitive and wary about. So let's begin with what Gandhiji says. I am always sort of going back to the text, because one of the efforts of this series on the text is to carefully read the text. Very often you tend to summarize, and when you summarize, you often lose the strength of the detailed content. Many of you have requested me to write or speak in Hindi. Hindi is a language which I am not very comfortable with, but we are really trying very hard to have Hindi language discussions. But in the case of Hind Swaraj, this is one text which is available in Hindi on the internet. So I would really encourage you to look at the Hindi text for those of you who are more comfortable than the others in English. Now the editor, which as I repeatedly said before is Gandhi himself, says railways, lawyers and doctors have impoverished the country so much so that if we do not wake up in time, we shall be ruined. And the reader says, which is of course also Gandhi, I do now indeed fear that we are not likely to agree at all. You are attacking the very institutions which we have always considered to be good. And Gandhiji responds with reference to the railways, it must be a manifest to you that but for the railways, the English could not have such a hold on India as they have. The railways too have spread the bubonic plague. Now this is one way of sort of dramatically conveying the idea that railways, the British were interested in developing railways so that they could have better control over the entire country. Many of you would be also familiar with that the first railways which the British set up was basically to connect centers of raw materials like coal in the Chota Nagpur area, which is present day Jharkhand, with the ports like Calcutta, Madras, Bombay for trade. So the railways were the handmaidens the support system of modern colonially driven industrialization in India. They needed the railways to collect their raw material like cotton, take them in their ships to Britain, manufacture them, bring back the finished product and sell it in India at a much reduced price. You also know that this kind of controlled trade, which went against the interests of the Indians, led to great impoverishment. You had a destruction of artisans' textile industry in India, ruination of people who would spin or textiles, which we were known globally for, people who went into the rural areas because they had lost their livelihood in textiles. So the point that he's trying to make is that the railways were central to British rule or colonial rule. He also adds, he talks about the plague and the fact that when you have any contagious disease and people are moving in large numbers from one place to the others, you would have the spread of diseases too, which is part of modernity. A good example, which perhaps many of you already know, is that when Europeans landed in the United States of America, a lot of the American Indians, the original inhabitants of the American continent, died because they were not immune to the diseases which the Europeans brought with them. We also know this has very often happened to forest dwellers in our own part of the world, say in Andaman Nicobar Island, where people who were not exposed to the diseases of a civilized world fell prey to it and died. Now, you may or may not agree with Gandhiji's point about railways being necessarily destructive. But what is important is that you now start seeing the complex and the double-edged ways by which railways operated. You would also be knowing that when the British started the tea plantations in northeastern India, they used the railways to take people from Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand in large numbers packed in their coaches so that they could work as labor in the tea gardens. Many of them died in the way. So the point that Gandhiji is trying to say that the railways were used by the British in order to perpetuate their rule, in order to expropriate the money and the wealth and destroy the people of this country. This is one aspect of the railways. We'll come to other questions. Was that the only role of railways? But it's important to understand the intent with which the colonial state or the British started the railways. He goes on to argue that without the railways, the masses could not move from place to place. They are the carriers of plague germs. Formerly, we had natural segregations, but railways have often increased the frequency of famines because owing to facility of means of location, people sell out their grain and it is sent to the dearest market. So it's very interesting that you have a lot of anti-developmental discussion in the contemporary period, even in the West, and very often they go back to Gandhi to understand why he had anticipated some of the issues which confront us together. Now, you could ask that, okay, was Gandhi dogmatic? If this was his view of modernity and development, railways, lawyers, doctors, was he dogmatic? And here it's very important to understand that Gandhiji was open to critique, he was open to debate, he was open to discussion. And this is a legacy which India should be proud of and which the new generation should carry forward ahead. What is common feature of all the other appreciative reviews? You see, Hind Swaraj was reviewed widely across the globe, and many of them were very appreciative reviews, but many of them were critical of Gandhiji's views. So what is a common feature of all the other appreciative reviews of the book is, in the reviewer's opinion, Gandhiji's unwarranted condemnation of machinery. They felt, well, is it really worth that Gandhiji is blaming everything on machinery? And there is this gentleman called Middleton Murray, and he says in one of his reviews that, Gandhiji was open to put out Hind Swaraj to the public for greater debate and discussion. This is something we urgently need in the contemporary period. In fact, this is the reason why I felt that a series on key texts would be important, because today we see 1-minute videos, we see 2-minute pictorial issues, we see breaking news, and we don't have the time and the patience to read the texts. But these texts actually open up the possibility of having a more serious, in-depth, engaged debate. So Gandhiji at that point of time, he didn't just put up Hind Swaraj on social media where either people said very good, put the thumbs up or put the thumbs down, but he put it across to the reading public across the globe, and some people were critical of it, and he was willing to listen to that critique. He forgets in the urgency of his vision, says Middleton Murray, that the very spinning wheel he loves is also a machine, is also unnatural. On his principles, it should be abolished. And this, another professor says, is a fundamental philosophical error. It implies that we must necessarily look at machine as morally evil. But the critique goes on to say, even the spinning wheel is a machine. Even the spectacles on the nose are mechanisms for bodily eyesight. The plough is a machine. The earliest mechanisms for drawing water is a machine. Everything in our thousands and 10,000 years of human effort is our negotiation with Marx. Any mechanism may be misused, but if it is, the moral evil is in the man who misuses it, not in the mechanism. Look at this detailed discussion. It is a debate on technology. It's a debate, is technology necessarily bad? Is social media necessarily bad? Or is it a double-edged weapon? It can be used to spread hate. It can be used to spread love. It can be used to spread the kind of lectures that we are doing, and I'm constantly grateful for a government which had started this kind of possibility of reaching out to people not just in India but across the globe. So the same instrument, the same machinery can be used for both. And the argument that this professor who was criticizing Gandhi is saying, it's not the machine which is morally evil, but it is the human beings. And we can go further by saying it is perhaps the structure of the society or groups which would be responsible for whether a machine is used for good or a machine is used for something which is necessarily evil and against human interests. Gandhiji did not shy away from this criticism. He responded. He responded to the question whether he was against all machinery. And he says, what a beautiful way of saying it, how can I be against all machinery when I know that even this body is the most delicate piece of machinery? The spinning wheel is a machine, the little toothpick is a machine. What I object, and listen to this very carefully, what I object is the craze for machinery, not machinery as such. The craze is for what they call labor-saving machinery. Men go on saving labor till thousands are without work and thrown on the open streets to die of starvation. Here comes the question of time and labor and machinery. And this has a particular value in our country where we have great underemployment, unemployment. We have more labor than machinery, and initially when we had the introduction of computers, this was a debate in our country that the computer is going to do away with a lot of human labor and what would happen to employment or unemployment. So again you notice the relevance of this text for contemporary debates on role of technology, role of machinery, and who is to be blamed for this. So one of the lessons that we learn from the Hind Swaraj is the virtue of being argumentative. We rarely find people, and Gandhiji, this is a quote from Hind Swaraj, he says, we rarely find people arguing against themselves. And he says this is what people should do. It is easy to argue with people who hold different views from you, and you want to prove your point. But let's argue amidst ourselves as good teachers in universities, we have to encourage this spirit of argumentation and debate. This does not mean you are my enemy and I'm my enemy. It is try to harness and develop our ability to debate. The best parliamentary debates, which would be in the Indian parliaments in the 50s and the 60s, or even partly in the 70s, were informed debates where people were arguing against different kinds of position. We have to have differences of opinion, but nevertheless I shall only argue only when you stop me. So here is Gandhiji trying to say that he is not just against questions of modernity, not mechanical opposition to machinery, but trying to show that you should not have a mindless search for machinery, a mindless craze for machinery. Likewise, he is open to debate, he is open to various kinds of views. Now, what are the ways that we can look at, the possible ways of looking at reading a text? And this is a point that I would like to sort of slowly, end my discussion on the Hind Swaraj, that there are various ways of looking at the text. And there are people who would be familiar with reading questions of text who would argue that when you write something, say I write a book or whoever writes a book, and in this case of course Gandhiji's Hind Swaraj, can we see it entirely by the intent of the author? The author wanted to write it in this fashion, and it is a response or an expression of what the author intended to do. Or can we see it as a text which has a certain autonomy apart from Gandhiji? Now, when we discuss this in the tail end of 2018, Gandhiji is long gone. The text stays alive and the text acquires new meaning. He couldn't have anticipated what is happening and what are the challenges today. But what we notice in the text, that it has a certain open-endedness for interpretation. So when we read a text, we don't read it only by what is written in the literal sense of the term. And Hind Swaraj cannot be understood in the literal sense of the term. It is like a parable. It's like a folklore. When we talk about the good and the bad, the evil, we've just had, the season of various kinds of festivals. We just had Durga Puja, Dasera, now we're going to have, Diwali. And in all this, there is a kind of tradition of the good versus the bad, of virtue against, the evil. Now, in a certain sense, even when we read epics or when we read poetry or when we read novels or when we read parables, we see multiple ways of engaging. That is why those epics are of such great value, because you've had scholars, interpreters over the centuries and generation trying to analyze, was this act by so and so in an epic correct? Was it morally just? Can it be just? Likewise, Hind Swaraj has to be understood not something mechanically that this is what Gandhiji wrote, but as an open-ended text which will able to help us understand what is going on in today's world. First point is that he is expressing a certain critique of modernity. He is expressing that critique of modernity because he is writing at a point of time where the Home Rule or Swaraj has become a powerful social movement. The national movement against the British has become stronger, has spread across the world. And he is trying to say that will we achieve the kind of world, the kind of India which we wish to, if we just replace the British with Indians, if we replace British lawyers by Indian lawyers, British parliamentarians by Indian parliamentarians, British doctors by Indian doctors, can we have the kind of real autonomy that we are seeking? And he says that we can only have that kind of Swaraj if we engage with what are the possibilities and the issues which are plaguing the Western world. And he is trying to say that modernity is very often structured by over-centralization. You have large scale development, you have industrialization which is large scale. It is not looking at the village level community. It's not looking at the needs of the people right there at the ground level. It's talking about large scale modernity, industrialization, and we talk about large scale industrialization, we talk about the industrialists. We talk about the big business who are sort of expanding across the world, expanding and taking over small villages, ruining earlier forms of production. And he says that is that the right kind of development? So what he is really doing is an alternative form of development, an alternative nature of development, saying that the development has to be addressed to the question of subsistence economy at the ground level. So he had the idea of the Swaraj at the village level, an economy which was micro, not macro. Forget global, because we're living in a global economy. In fact, colonialism was a global economy, but a skewed economy, that it was basically colonized India for the development of British interests, and in the process it led to great dispossession and pauperization of our peasants, our artisans, our indigenous craft, our indigenous trade, and even our own sense of pride. So it's a very sharp critique of modernity. Today in 2018, with various ecological disasters towards the possibility of reaching a point where we will no longer have fossil-led fuel, where we have an oil crisis, where we have questions of global warming, maybe it is time to talk about, it's natural for people to be aware about critiques of development. But this was Gandhiji writing in 1908. Now, what is important to understand, this Gandhiji did have a certain kind of perspective on development, but did he impose that development on everybody else, or did India actually move towards a development which was a little different from Gandhiji's? So we actually did have a planned development, we had heavy industrialization, but we also had a certain focus on khadi, on village kind of production, on questions of spinning, on crafts. And we of course have to remember in this context Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who brought back so many of those crafts which we are going to lose. The question of Swaraj. So the question that he began Hind Swaraj is, what is Swaraj? And he told the reader, be a little patient, be a little patient. I can't explain Swaraj in one line. And I find this very instructive, because today everybody wants one line definition. But in order to explain what Swaraj is, Gandhiji had to go through an entire book and a conversational mode. Very interesting, something we need to cherish. The very format of the book is a debate. The very format of the book is a conversation, and the conversation is taking place between the reader and the editor, and Gandhiji is both the reader and the editor. So Gandhiji is being able to place himself as the defender of his views as well as a critic of his views. How many of us are able to do it today? So it's very important that when you read Hind Swaraj, when you read this or hear this lecture, that you open up, don't necessarily agree with what is being said. Learn, go back to the text and argue these questions. The very format of the book is inspiring, because it is like a parable. It is somebody asking questions, somebody responding. It's very, very important in today's context to go back to a text very, very long time ago, 1908, written at a different period of time by Gandhiji, and see it as something which offers us possibilities of engaging with some of the developmental questions which are so critical in the contemporary period. Thank you very much.
With this note, thank you so much for giving us this productive session. Dear friends, we believe that you might have gathered lots and lots of information, and you might have certain questions too. So friends, you can write your questions at info.cec@nic.in, as well as you can post your feedbacks too. We would love to have your questions and feedbacks, and next time when Professor Maitri Chaudhary visits our studio, we promise to give answers to your questions through this live platform. This lecture is going to be uploaded on YouTube soon. Dear friends, if you wish to watch other lectures pertaining to the series, that is Key Text in Social Sciences and Humanities, then all the lectures which we have conducted so far are there for you on YouTube. And after watching those lectures, you feel so that you have questions, you are welcome, your questions are welcome. So keep writing to us and keep watching us. We will be delighted to give answers to your questions. We are taking your leave with the promise that we are going to meet again very soon and would be conducting more sessions under the series. And once again, now I would like to thank our guest, Professor Maitri Chaudhary.
Thank you,
ma'am. Thank you so much.